This is Aqui Ahora, a podcast under the auspices of PAG.law, the Miami-based legal firm with expertise and experience in venture capital throughout the Americas. Our host today is Juan Pablo Cappello, president and founder of PAG.law. Aqui Ahora welcomes today Logan Herzog. Logan Herzog is the co-founder and chief research officer at Go, a Costa Rican startup whose products help founders scale their companies without scaling their team. He previously worked at GrowthX Asia, a growth-focused accelerator program in SEA for B2B and Enterprise startups, where he developed curriculum and training for founders and corporate innovation teams. Logan started his career as a growth hacker, working for graduates at YC 500 startups, Techstars, and more. He spends free time with his wife and two daughters playing guitar and researching places he would live if he could clone himself. We leave with you now, and I hope playing the guitar at times, we leave with you now Logan Herzog and Juan Pablo Cappello.
Logan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, it's really a pleasure. I remember in the 2000s when the TecnoLatino wasn't sort of going anywhere. Every year it was just sort of $150 to $300 million investing. There was Endeavor, there was Lavka, but there just wasn't much else. You know, there weren't co-working spaces, there weren't accelerator programs. There just wasn't much happening in the tech space in LATAM. I always kept thinking, man, it would be so great if we could get, you know, people from the US and elsewhere to start discovering the amazing opportunities in LATAM. And so when I began following your tweets, which is so interesting because you, at least from what I can see, you make at least one tweet a day, sometimes several, all around what it's like for non-Latin to be launching a business in Latin America, and in this case, in Costa Rica. It seems like you've traveled the world. Why don't we talk a little bit about, you know, sort of what's been your experience as an entrepreneur? I don't know if you consider yourself a digital nomad. Is that, you know, too passé? But yeah, let's talk about where your quote unquote, where your journey literally and figuratively really began.
Yeah, so I never set out to be a digital nomad. Part of it has appealed to me. I kind of got thrust into this and then got hooked, and I'll explain it a little bit. So I learned Spanish as a volunteer in the US years ago. At least, you know, workable Spanish. I'm not sure I'll ever call myself fluent, but so I've always, ever since then, I've had interest in Latin
By the way,
America.
we're all just a work in progress, so
right.
You know, that's fine. I'm hoping I can die reasonably fluent in life, so that's
right. Exactly.
Not a terrible thing.
I'm not going to let it stop me, that's for sure. But,
Exactly.
It was always in the back of my mind to work in Latin America, but honestly, after I came back from my volunteer time, I forgot about that for a little bit. I started out really just wanting to be a growth hacker, wanting to work with startups, really enjoying the start of anything. I ended up getting hired to go out to Malaysia to launch an accelerator program, which, you know, Asia was never on my radar. But when the opportunity came, I jumped at it. But while I was there, I started recognizing, like, man, like there's just so much cool stuff going on out here. So many brilliant founders, so many huge problems that are just begging to be solved, that I just found a lot of indifference in the US towards the region. And when I started probing my Latin America, I noticed the same, which shocked me because we have so many cultural similarities, so much in common.
Right.
There's so much the continent has to offer. I'm surprised that I'm not the first one by any means to discover it, but there's not as many people writing about it as I thought. But fast forward, as soon as I got the opportunity to come to Latin America, a startup brought me out there to do sales. I jumped at it because I figured I really want to discover what's going on out here. I can go much further here with Spanish than I could in Malaysia or Southeast Asia with no local language.
Right.
But It's cool. It's cool to hear that people are excited that there's more participation. I'm just shocked that it hasn't happened earlier, to be honest. So,
and how did you settle on Costa Rica? I mean, I think it's an amazing country. Are you a surfer, or did the fact that they don't have a standing army attract you?
I mean,
are you a plant medicine guy? I mean, it's so interesting because
right?
it's not known as sort of, well, I guess for Central America, it's sort of a tech hub, but obviously, in terms of foreigners, Brazil is really where foreigners have really made their themselves felt.
Yeah, I mean, coming to Costa Rica, as much as I wish I could say I planned this, I just completely happenstance. I had two options when I was hired by a company called TalkPush. It was either Mexico City or San Jose, Costa Rica. I have two little girls and thought it's gonna be a lot easier to raise them in a environment in San Jose, even though I was already pretty familiar with the Mexican culture through my I grew up in Texas, so Mexico to me, from a cultural perspective, is very familiar, and I have a lot of appreciation for it. But San Jose just seemed like a much more relaxed, laid back environment for the kids. I am not here for the tech scene. I think anybody in Costa, there are several amazing founders here. I don't think any of us will say that we're here because of the tech scene. I think we're here because of other things. Right. And whether I'm here forever, I don't know. My business partner here is Costa Rican. He's a brilliant salesperson in his own right. So there's plenty of talent. But I will say that from a quality, I've been to probably 10 different countries in Latin America at this point, and Caribbean. And we'll say that it's hard to beat the quality of life you can get here, for sure. So there's plenty of reasons to stay, but coming here wasn't exactly planned, to be totally honest. So.
And when did you, so one thing I thought is very interesting in your blog, which is not something, well, I say blog, but these series of tweets, but quite honestly, when you read it, sort of, maybe if you're reading it day by day, but if you do what I did, which is, sort of discover it and then sort of power through it, it feels like a blog.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because you talk about how a non-local founder, or somebody who's just curious about the local tech scene, can connect with the tech scene locally, and how there's certain traps to avoid. Yep. For instance, things I would have never thought. And it's interesting because I'm from Chile, so when I got to Chile, there was no tech scene, and yep. I sort of saw it developed, and I'm a bit of an insider. And so I've never had to look at things, from the outsider's perspective. And I found that so interesting. And I think you have some really amazing tips for non-local founders. So let's talk about some of those, because some of them are, from my perspective, sort of counterintuitive. Like, don't set yourself up at a co-working space run by foreigners, or just certain things that I would have thought, yep. Oh, that's where you want to go, and you're saying no, don't go there.
Yeah, well, so it was really good to do this. I did this first in Asia, again, where I had zero local language ability, and very little understanding of the local culture, and came to love it. But it was an advantage to me because I was really starting from zero, right? I mean, it was very difficult to find information. And it isn't, particularly in Southeast Asia, a lot of these co-working spaces and community events that are geared towards the tech scene are really geared towards digital nomads. And it's a very different scene. I have been curious, and I've been kind of honestly looking for confirmation bias to see that digital nomadism is really good for startup ecosystems. I don't think it's bad, but I've actually come to just kind of believe that it's not particularly helpful or detrimental, but it's not really building long-term growth in the local region because they're nomads. They're not really going to stick around. So there's some cross-pollination happening there. But when you look at these co-working spaces and these community events that are built for nomads, you're going to find few locals who are really participating. And that's really what I'm looking for when I'm coming to an ecosystem. I'm a foreigner. I need to work with local people to understand what the situation is. And in the United States, we particularly tend to think that, the government is very ineffective, and there's definitely truth.
Yeah.
But the government programs, the reality is there's two things I'm looking for when I'm coming to a new place. One, I'm trying to find the the most competent people who are able to actually have influence, as much influence as possible in the local ecosystem. And then also the reality is you're trying to de-risk your investment. I think that's what I'm preaching a lot to these, product managers and such from Silicon Valley who do some angel investing and now can work remotely and are considering, should I live abroad? And really, if you want to look at the opportunity cost that they perceive, I don't see it the same way, but I understand that, people in the US may see it as additional risk. And for me, you want to de-risk that. And that's really only going to come from these government programs who have the tax benefits and, the free office space and stuff. There's a lot you can get in exchange if you meet the right people. And so as a US citizen, it was a bit counterintuitive to my culture of go to the government programs first. And this when you're talking about Mexico City and even Chile now, there's so many private organizations doing great things that I don't think this applies.
Right.
If you're in a smaller market where it's just not as developed, it's these public programs that will actually at least have the resources to incentivize you to set up shop there. So, and I just didn't find as much value going to co-working spaces and events.
Yeah, no, it is. It's so counterintuitive. Obviously, Chile's with Startup Chile, has done an amazing outreach program. Though I have to say, as a Chilean taxpayer, I'm not so sure that that's where I would have actually allocated. Given the huge income inequality, et cetera, that's how I would have allocated my spend. But I'm happy as a tech entrepreneur that that's happened. And so, what kinds of programs? I mean, beyond just what you've seen in Costa Rica, what are those kinds of programs? Because I think, as you say, the people who are listening to this who are thinking about maybe coming from the U.S. to one of these markets in Latin America, what kind of support, what kind of programs do they exist that are relevant for digital nomads or entrepreneurs who are looking to set up shop?
Yeah, I mean, so there's almost always a publicly backed but privately run organization that's in charge of startup growth. So these are the people who have the keys to the incentives, and usually they're working in tandem with the development bank, and if there's a Zona Franca involved, they're usually going to be associated with that. That's what I'm looking for. Like in Montevideo, for example, they'd be called Uruguay 21.
Right.
Is their example. A lot of times they're also attached to kind of these foreign investment agencies, people who are trying to bring in foreigners to invest, but they're also a lot of times thrown in with the startup scene, right? So whether they're also partnering with Chamber of Commerce and stuff, it takes a few different forms. So there's usually a program that has some kind of partnership with an investment fund who has either always been VC, or it could actually be, a lot of times, they're traditional investors just now breaking into it. But it's normally that's why it tends to work better than what you'd think going to a government office, because it's actually private people running it, but they're using public funds. So there's definitely government bureaucracy involved to a certain extent, but they've privatized the front of it to make it easier for you to engage and make it a little more inviting and smooth for foreigners. That to me is like the perfect place to start if you're in a mid-sized city. And because you're usually going to have a few people who understand what startup growth really is, because it's not like a government employee per se, at least historically. But you're still going to get access to a lot of the government programs, especially if you're a foreigner and you're wanting to do business. You need to know, okay, like what kind of visas do I need, right? Like those are all things that, having done that multiple times with children in about 4 countries in the last 2 years, it is way more complex than you anticipate if you're going to do anything other than a tourist visa. And so that to me is actually one of the biggest kickers, is like you have an organization on the ground associated with the government who has an incentive to get you to be able to stay. So they're going to try and set you up as best as possible, right? That to me, it exists in most places, even, from Vietnam to Colombia. I was in Cali. I have a good friend, Manolo at Invest Pacific, which is technically the foreign investment agency for that region around Cali. But they also dive into the startup world and work with some of those incentives. So that's usually what I'm looking for. It's not like a easily Googleable search, but if you find it, that's usually where you're going to get the most value, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's actually, you talk about something super interesting, which is, as you know, for many people not from Latin America, they sort of talk about Latin America as if it's one country, right? One place. And leaving aside, the obvious, okay, maybe they understand Brazil's different, but It's almost like, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, whatever. But you actually talk about something that's more subtle, but also very strong, which is this regionalism in countries. So like in Colombia, you have Medellin, and where you have the Antioqueños, and you have the Bogota, and they're very different ecosystems. Or obviously in Brazil, Sao Paulo doesn't look or feel at all like Rio, and you sort of mentioned, if you're at medium-sized cities, what's your sense? Definitely 5 years ago, it was sort of the notion was anything worth happening in any of our countries in LATAM was happening at the capital city. That's maybe not the case anymore. And I just wanted to sort of get your reaction to that.
Yeah, I have always, to give some context too, I've always been a fan of kind of secondary cities. I was born in the Bay Area, but actually was raised in Austin. So being being part of that smaller ecosystem growing up and seeing how, this is a small city that punches well above its weight, but we loved our quality of life there. Well, I'd go back to the Bay Area every now and then for family trips and see that it was deteriorating in a lot of ways. Now I still love San Francisco, but never did I see both cities.
I don't think, unfortunately, that that trend has eased in the last few months.
No, it's gotten a lot worse. And I think anybody who spent time around the city saw this coming, and just, it's sad. And I have a very soft spot in my heart for the Bay Area because of my family ties. But I never once looked at both cities and thought San Francisco is a better place to live than Austin, right? And you're right. It's really, when I first started my career, everybody was telling me, listen, remote work wasn't nearly as popular. The only people allowing you to work remotely really were startups. And so I started, I went to school in Utah, but I was working with people in Silicon Valley from day one.
And that wasn't because they wanted to. It was because they couldn't pay you a good enough salary to really impose on you many restrictions, including what you'd wear or where you'd work, right?
Exactly right. They're like, hey, I don't have to pay this guy Bay Area salary. Cool, I'll take the chance, right? So you're exactly right there, and that it's not changing. But I learned really early on is like, okay, it's not necessarily true that you have to live in the quote unquote hub of whatever your industry is. Like, it is possible. It's become a lot easier now. And as I travel around, like I'll be the first to say that Bogota is a maravilla. It's a beautiful city. I always love spending time there. I personally, my weak gringo self can't handle the elevation. I'm always really sick. So whenever I go to Colombia, I'm always excited to be in Bogota, but quickly go to Medellin, where it's just not as painful for me to be. And I find the same thing. Okay, it's a smaller city. It reminds me a lot of that dynamic between Austin and a lot of other larger cities in the US, where you have beautiful surroundings. You still have very innovative people with Medellin's culture, which I think is a beautiful story in its own right. But never once would I think, for me personally, Bogota is a better place to live overall than Medellin. And I think now, especially if you have experience, if you're gonna, if you're a first-time founder and you really need a lot of hand-holding, I totally understand the need to be in a specific place. Those resources can be very valuable. But the reality is, unless you're in San Francisco, or unless you're in maybe New York or Sao Paulo here, or maybe even in Chile, if you throw that in there, I don't necessarily think that the perks outweigh the benefits of living somewhere else that's a little bit more conducive to your lifestyle, especially pre-COVID. Who knows what afterwards? But pre-COVID, right. Flights within the country were relatively cheap, so you have access to these places. And I just think, especially for a foreigner, the biggest risk you have of doing business in Latin America is that you don't stay. And I think try and find a place where you're comfortable, where you can adjust, where your quality of life is truly better than before, and it'll be easy to justify working and staying in the region. And I just don't think that access is as big an issue anymore. So,
yeah, I saw on, I think it was on your in your Twitter that you were in the south of Chile. Were you in Puerto Varas or something? I saw.
I've actually never been on the ground in this part, but I was researching southern Chile
Right.
Valdivia was a place
Valdivia. It was Valdivia.
Like,
yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
It's a great example of a city that probably most Chileans would be like, yeah, we know Valdivia, of course. Like, it's a beautiful place, you know, the pros and cons. But as an American citizen, even though I literally look at maps for fun, I hadn't even heard of Valdivia until 3 weeks ago, you know? So, you know, you have these gems of places that would, you know, be a beautiful place to live, that would give you a lot of elements of Europe or the Pacific Northwest in Valdivia's case, right? But at a much more reasonable price, but still decent access to a city like Santiago via air. You know, these are places that most of us have no idea exist. And especially in Latin America, there's so much politics around the region and there's so much stereotypes, but South America has so much to offer. So it's definitely something that I'm kind of on a mission on now, is like, hey, these places exist, and I don't know, for better or worse, I think more gringos should understand those places. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because one reason I'm always interested and excited to have conversations like this is I'm always interested in the perspective of people who are seeing things sort of for the first time. Yep. Because they come to it without those prejudices. I mean, the problem is, you know, growing up in Santiago, or if you grow up in the region, yeah, there is sort of, you know, we say in Spanish, you know, Santiago es el hoyo del queque, you know, the center of everything, right? And you sort of, you know, not look down, but despreciar, you know, not value a lot of the amazing things going on in these secondary cities. And as you point, especially in some of these big cities, I mean, Sao Paulo and Mexico City are, I think, the best examples. I mean, the quality of life in those cities is horrific for most people. Even if you have a lot of money, they can be exciting. There can be a lot of opportunities and things, but you know, quality of life on virtually any measure is not very good. And you're right that if you're living in Valdivia, I don't know what, you know, $250,000, $300,000 gets you in terms of housing, but I know it's a whole lot. It's a whole lot. And there probably are some very good schools. Probably there is an American-ish school, et cetera. And if your idea is to really, it's interesting because my mother is American, and she moved to Chile when she was 18. She dropped out of Northwestern, pregnant with me, and I think the Santiago she found is probably a lot more similar, and she fell in love with, is a lot more similar to Valdivia al día de hoy than with the Santiago of today. And you're right. I mean, that is one of the interesting things, which I'm just sort of realizing now as we're talking. And that's why these sort of fresh eyes that somebody like brings to this conversation, somebody like you brings to this conversation, so interesting to me. Because, right, you're making me think that what is charming and wonderful about these towns is that they feel lost in time. And it was interesting because Montevideo used to be sort of the last capital of Latin America that felt like it was still stuck in the 1960s, right? And that changed radically in the last 5 or 6 years. But it was amazing to go to Montevideo because, you know, at 9 a.m. on La Rambla, you know, which is sort of the main thoroughfare, it felt like there was virtually no rush hour commute. Again, that's changed a lot.
Well, and I think what my generation's looking for is very different now. I mean, if you look at, I'll get to Montevideo in a second. I think it's one of my favorite cities in
right. Let's talk
Latin America. But I think like it's interesting because if you look, I follow the Silicon Valley Twitter pretty closely, and what you're seeing now, for years you've seen people complain and always talk, maybe I should go, and now I think they're finally starting to do it because they can. My wife is from rural Idaho. She's from southern Idaho, not a place where many tech people live, and yet her dad's neighbor just sold their house in rural Idaho. They live outside of a town of 2,000 people. Okay, this is the middle of nowhere, beautiful. They just sold it to somebody, quote unquote, escaping the Bay Area, right? So it's like you have these people who are willing to move to rural Idaho, where ideologically couldn't be more different from San Francisco anyway. Like, if you're open to that much change, there's places you can go that I think, as much as I love rural Idaho, are a bit more interesting and have a bit more opportunity in the business sense. And I think as my generation is starting to shift more towards quality of life focus, and we used to be all about cities. I think now we're all looking at some of these rural areas. I think that places like Montevideo are actually really interesting, where it's like, okay, so I get the architecture and I get very similar culture to Buenos Aires. I hope Argentinians don't beat me up for that.
No. I think there's a lot of Argentines in tech who are moving to Montevideo and Punta. So I think there's a lot of people who will not be offended.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is you have from an outsider perspective, it's very familiar if you spent time in Argentina, and yet you don't have the rush hour traffic and stuff. To me, it reminds me a lot of, the difference between Austin, although Austin now has a lot of traffic, so maybe a bad comparison, but a smaller city with a much higher quality of life, that still reminds you of another city that's still really exciting and big. So I just think it's all about what people are looking for now. And Montevideo, although I'm sure a few years ago people would have been like, it's boring. Like, why are you going to Montevideo? That's kind of the point, is that I get a lot of the benefits of these larger cities, a lot of the vibe. But I remember walking around Montevideo at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday and nobody was driving. I thought that was actually kind of great. So.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you alluded to your generation. So how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I just turned 29, so I'm a millennial technically. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's so interesting because I'm squarely close to double your age, and which is a great milestone. And for me, I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, as you see your generation, and you sort of allude to that, you guys were, maybe, the kinds of people who would, in New York move to Williamsburg, or look for these sort of edgy neighborhoods in the Bay Area or in New York City. And now, do you think that this has been driven by COVID, or was something you guys were beginning, you and your peers were beginning to feel just a little bit sort of itchy, like, okay, that was nice, but I don't need a coffee bar on every corner. And maybe I'm looking for something a little more authentic and a few less, bearded guys with tattoos.
I mean, I think sorry, there was a little bit of a breakup. I feel like I cut you off there, but
no worries.
I think part of it is just growing up. I mean, a lot of people want to talk about millennials like we're the avocado toast, students still, but a lot of us are having kids. A lot of us are getting older, and a lot of us want to, maybe not at the same rate as our
30. You're almost 30,
right?
You're getting old.
I mean, and there's millennials. There are people who are still technically millennials that are in their late 30s, right? So we're a much older generation, and people realize. So like, you have this group where, I mean, I think there's kind of two ways I've seen it going, and COVID has just been an accelerant. I don't think it's the root cause. It's just we now have the option to do this, whereas previous generations, you're kind of, Williamsburg is about as good as you're going to get if you want that Manhattan job, unless you want to have a really crazy commute or pay a bunch of money to live in Connecticut or something, right? But the reality is, there's options now, and I think there's kind of two ways that I've thought about it, and that I think a lot of my friends have thought, is a lot of them love kind of romanticize the idea of living in a cabin or something a lot more rural and nature filled. We're thinking a lot about that with our kids, and I think you live in a city for a while, and as an adult you love it. When you see your kids trying to deal with it, it's a little more tricky. But I think these smaller cities are a great option. Montevideo, although it's got a few million people in it, you got beach around. It's a much quieter city. It's a much more livable city for a family, in my opinion, than even Buenos Aires, even though I think Buenos Aires is a little more exciting and maybe even a little more beautiful. And so I think that these priorities are shifting. And to me, the beauty of these medium-sized cities, and this is what happened in Austin too, is, I can still have a city with a lot of the amenities that I want, but I don't have to live in New York. I don't have to give up everything, I think that's what a lot of these mid-sized cities offer. That's why I've always been intrigued. I had kids quite early in my mid-20s. So I was a little bit ahead of the curve there and had to think about these things a bit earlier in my life than a lot of my generation has. But I think now a lot of millennials are changing priorities, and thankfully, there's a lot of things that maybe haven't gone our way. But I think in this case, the option to be able to work from different places is something that is great, and that I think we're going to take advantage of. So,
and when you look at the rest of Latin America, what are the countries or cities? When we talked about, Valdivia or Medellin, but and you've mentioned Montevideo. What are the other cities that you sort of think might be, undervalued gems for the either digital nomad or somebody who wants to sort of launch a business?
That's a really good question. So a few thoughts. I actually really like the areas outside of Medellin. If you want more like a mountainous lifestyle, like there's a tiny town called La Ceja, which is it's a small town outside of Medellin, about 45 minutes south. And it's kind of over by Rio Negro. It's about 25, 30 minutes from the airport, up above the city. But it's like this really bikeable town. A lot of locals will cycle around town. You want to talk about money going far? $100,000 to $200,000 would get you a beautiful place up in the hills. You still are within, decent access to Medellin, but you have a really, really beautiful lifestyle up there. I'm actually really intrigued by places like Quito. I mean, COVID's changed a little bit about how we view these cities. Quito to me is a really impressive city, and how much infrastructure they've developed there. I didn't spend a ton of time on the ground, but I feel like there was a lot of forward progress in that area. COVID again may change some of those things, but as of January when I was there, I was really impressed with Quito. If you can handle the altitude, which again I don't know if I can. Panama City is kind of intriguing to me. Like I think that it's a very it's very easy to get into an expat bubble in Panama City. But my business partner actually grew up there, and I see a lot of interesting opportunities there. I know there's definitely some reputation that the area has. So I don't know if, from a incorporation standpoint, what the benefits or downsides are there. But I think that provides a very kind of Miami vibe, but honestly has an economy that reminds me a lot of Hong Kong, and a vibe that reminds me sort of Hong Kong. I wrote about some parallels there, which I thought was really interesting. So I think a lot of these, even places like Argentina, which sadly it's a tough situation there now. Argentina is full of really interesting cities where you can live. Concepcion in Chile, I know that has a reputation amongst Chileans, but I've talked to a lot of people who live there and see, if you have the budget and if you want basically San Francisco weather, but at a fraction of the price, there's definitely some interesting places there for you. So for me, what I usually do is I basically look at what are the second and third tier cities in all of these countries in South America, even Florianopolis in Brazil. So those are those are some of the places where I just think, man, like we just don't know enough about these places. Maybe they're not the best places to live, but the fact that we don't know about them to me just seems absolutely insane. So,
no, that's so interesting. Yeah, I guess. The issue, but it just depends on the company you're building, right? Is what are you doing, right? Because it's very different if you're a digital nomad and you're working for a company based in the Bay Area, or you're a developer and you have clients spread around the world, and they don't really care where you are as long as you have a good broadband connection and you get your work done, right? And so there, whether you're living in Valdivia or anywhere, it doesn't matter. And by the way, I'd add to that list Valparaíso in Chile.
Oh yeah,
which for me is about the coolest city in Latin America. And I mean, for me, it feels a little bit like Palermo, Hollywood. Neighborhoods in Argentina, but just with being on the ocean and having amazing views. Valpa, unfortunately, crime is an issue there, as it is in a lot of Latin America. But it's being Chile, it is somewhat under control. But yeah, going back to what I was saying before, I had to give Valpa a shout out. I guess it depends. If you're sort of a digital nomad and you have your clients and you're just interested in finding a place with a great quality of life, maybe you live there 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years kind of thing, just depending on how it goes, it's probably one calculus. On the other hand, if you're building a company, then it's a different calculus, because as you and I know, the reality is, most of the local venture capital, et cetera, is congregated around the capital city, with the exception of, Rio obviously has its own very robust tech ecosystem. Medellin, the Antioqueños are so, sort of independent that they've built their own infrastructure. But yeah, I do think you have to sort of think about what you're planning on doing. And it just depends, if you're really relying on the local market or not. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I can share from my perspective. So from a sales perspective, being forced to, when I got to Latin America, this was a year ago, almost exactly. The vibe is very much, you got to do sales in person. Face to face is critical. The sales perspective is very much that way. But I was shocked at how quickly we transitioned with COVID. Honestly, I've had some of the best quarters of my life in COVID. That's obviously not the case with everybody. And there is a lot of privilege. I have a network in the United States, in Silicon Valley, right? I have some names I can drop. I have a decent resume there, right? So there's a lot that I can lean on. That's why I really specify, if you're a seasoned founder, then there's a lot that you can do. If you're brand new starting out, I think it does make a lot more sense to focus on where the resources are at. I will say that sometimes it's better to be the bigger fish in a small pond. If there's any kind of startup in a smaller city, you're going to get a lot more attention than if you go to Santiago, right? So I mean, to me, there's some strong arguments. I spent 3 months in Da Nang, Vietnam, right smack in the middle of the country, 7 hours from Hanoi or from Ho Chi Minh City, where there's pretty solid startup ecosystems. But the fact, there's maybe 10 people really focused on startups there. But if anybody was there interested in it, you had all the resources of the city at your disposal. So a lot of it depends on if you're new, are there resources in your area? And if so, do you feel more confident that you can get those resources or have better access to them by having more face-to-face time, or by going to the big city? Kind of do you want 12 students in a classroom, or do you want 500, right? There's benefits to both of those scenarios.
Right. That's so interesting.
But if you're a seasoned operator from a growth perspective, it really has not held me back. Now, I'm not selling massive ticket items. I'm not selling big enterprise software anymore. This would be very much mid-tier. I can definitely see how people who are selling six-figure tech are going to have a little bit of trouble, not just because of budgets, but because, lack of access to people face-to-face right now. It's kind of the situation we're in anyway, though. So,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I sorry. Sometimes I shout. I realize I don't need. I can moderate my voice. It's radio, right? But I get excited when you say stuff like that, right? Because if you think about, COVID, everyone knows how the acceleration of digital adoption and all these trends, which seemed unthinkable 6 months ago. So I was just last night at a dinner with a number of very, very successful guys and women who run venture capital funds. And they were just commenting how it took them about 6 weeks to get over this hang up of not investing into a founder who they had not met personally, just met via Zoom, et cetera. And now, 6 months later, 5 months later, it seems completely normal to do that. And I guess, from what you're saying, it's somewhat the same with sales.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that was overrated. I kind of felt that way when I first got to the region, simply because we used to say that in the U.S. I grew up in the South. It's definitely kind of an old school sales approach there. You got to look somebody in the eye and shake their hand before they'll do business with you. But the more I dove into it, the more I actually started trying to do it, the more I realized that's not necessarily true. There's always exception to the rule, and now COVID's forced everybody to be the exception to the rule. So I do think it took a little bit of transition time. There's definitely a bad time in there for salespeople, right? February, March, April. But I think the world adjusted a lot faster than there's obviously some terrible things that are still happening. I don't want to downplay it, but I do think that we're not talking enough about how successful this remote transition really has been for a lot of people. There's plenty of people who got left behind, but I am grateful that not everything went away. I will say that when it comes to investment, it's different. I mean, you're talking to somebody who's building products to help people bootstrap through the seed phase. So I might not be the best person to ask about how it's affecting VC at the seed level. And And I can totally understand how that's a hang up for people. I just think more than ever, it's a time to think, how can I drive revenue? How can I, if you think about it, you're kind of on the same page as all the people who are in Santiago now. You know, no one can go to offices. Or maybe,
right.
If they can, it's a smaller rate. So if you're in Valdivia and you have value to offer, you're going to have as good a chance as anybody who's 2 blocks away but can't go see them in person. So right now is the ultimate time to see. And for me, as a salesperson, as an outbound guy, someone building products for this, it's all about how am I demonstrating my value? And I think everybody is now forced to communicate their value and think about what their business does. I think before it was a lot of relationships and you had a Rolodex and your relationships. And now it's, what do I actually do for people? And that's a great equalizer. I think it's a really good time in a lot of ways. And I think it will eventually lead us all to conclude that being in person all the time doesn't have to be the case. I think it's a great option, and it might be even a bit of a crutch. But if you're really good at communicating what you do for people, you're going to have options, in my opinion. Now, there's exceptions to the rule all around. That's a very sales-focused approach. You know, product dev. I'm sure there's a lot of other hangups there, but just from a sales perspective, that's my thought.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and as you know, I mean, sales is the driver. That in product development is the driver of any startup, right? And even there, it's quite interesting because as I hear you talk, and I talk with a lot of CEOs, and their biggest challenge is how to build their team.
Yep.
And you're sort of pointing out that one size doesn't fit all. And I'm actually thinking, this afternoon I have a couple mentoring sessions with founders in LATAM, and sort of pointing out, saying, hey, why don't you think out of the box and think about at least providing the option in terms of building a sales team to allow that sales team to live in Valparaíso or live in Valdivia or live in Punta del Este instead of Montevideo. Because as you're pointing out, maybe that doesn't really affect the ability of that person to do their job, especially knowing they can travel. But that may allow you to get a candidate you wouldn't have otherwise gotten, or it may allow you to offer a compensation package that's more variable or lower cost than what you'd have to pay if you're competing for talent in one of the major cities.
And I think to summarize a lot of those thoughts, the reality is I think what we're all realizing is that we have options, and be creative with those options. It can be it can work one way where being close to the capital. And I'm talking about both politically and venture capital, right? Being close to investors is an advantage, but it doesn't necessarily put you close to your industry if you're in shipping, right? And an inland city like Santiago, like perhaps being at a port city makes a lot more sense for somebody to really understand. So maybe a product person can live somewhere where they're hands-on if you're in a logistics space or something, right? Like it can go both ways, where it gives people options to live where their industry is, or gives them an option just to live where they want to live because it doesn't really matter. But I think that we can be creative in that mix. And I'm excited to see what happens now that we have the options. I'm not preaching one way or the other. My situation is very specific. I do think it applies in some ways generally, but I think what especially people in the United States should consider, I'm looking at all these people who are now fully remote forever at Twitter, right? And think, well, where can you live on a great budget, but also the opportunity to have an impact, micro investing, writing small checks. It could be very powerful in a region like this. And I don't think there's enough people doing that. And so bringing those kinds of people here, even on a part-time basis, and helping them find a great quality of life in a way that makes sense is way more possible now than it was 5 years ago. And I'm excited to see what the world looks like once we start taking advantage of those options. That's a lot of what I'm writing about. So,
well, look, Logan, this has been amazing to chat with you. Actually, exactly what I was hoping would happen, which is to get sort of this new perspective from a set of fresh eyes. I love what you're doing. I really enjoy your Twitter feed. If I'd encourage you to repurpose the Twitter feed into some sort of blog as well. I encourage everyone who's listening to check you out, Logan Herzog. I'm sure you're easy to find on social media. One last question before we go. What advice do you have for the hinchas, for the supporters of the TecnoLatino, the LATAM tech ecosystem here and now, to maintain their optimism and fortitude in these difficult times?
I'm sorry, it broke up a little bit. I missed the first part of the question.
Sure, I'm going to ask it in Spanish because me sale más fácil. ¿Qué mensaje le quieres pasar a los hinchas del TecnoLatino aquí y ahora para que mantengan el optimismo y la fortaleza en estos momentos difíciles? You can answer in English.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a lot of thoughts here, but I think at the end of the day, I think the Latin American tech ecosystem is just starting in a lot. Now, obviously, I'm just starting to look at it. Someone like you've been looking at it for a while and you've seen the evolution. But I think that what we're going to find is as people start looking at being able to live in different places and have more flexibility, they're going to realize that Latin America offers almost everything that you would want in other continents, European style living, Southeast Asian style living, climate, architecture, all these things. And it's much closer. You have the advantage of being aligned longitude-wise, time zone-wise. I think that people are going to start realizing that there are a lot of advantages to living in the region. And I think we're going to finally start seeing a missing piece that's been for a while, which is people who are seasoned startup employees coming to the region and spreading some of their knowledge so that locals who understand local problems can really take off and have the talent pool to build what they've been wanting to build for a while. I really think we're just getting started. I think it's a brutal time for everybody. But I actually think 5-10 years down the road, we're going to attribute this moment to a big shift in talent, which is going to help this region take off in a lot of ways. So it's easy to say that from my perspective. I'm not living some of the day-to-day challenges that a lot of people in this region are facing, and I want to be sensitive to that. But I truly believe that this is absolutely primed to expand and explode over the next 5 to 10 years.
From your mouth to God's ears, as they say. Logan, it was a real pleasure. Continued success, and let's stay in touch.
Likewise, thanks, JP. Appreciate it.
Este fue otro programa de Aquí y Ahora, auspiciado por PAG.law, especialista en Venture Capital. Hasta pronto.